Welcome to The Power and the Glory, where we provide video content for doom-scrolling Catholics and fellow travelers. Mission, history, and heritage to reignite zeal for God and recalibrate the saint in training. Today, it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Avellina Balestri, who, in particular, regarding her latest work and its great implications for Catholic identity. So welcome, Avellina.
Thank you so much, James. It's a pleasure to be on.
Really. And I'll continue on a little bit in terms of this intro. Avellina is an author. She's a speaker, a musician, a historian with a love for English and early American history. She's also the editor-in-chief of Fellowship and Fairydust, a literary magazine inspiring faith and creativity and exploring the arts through a spiritual lens. And she views reality through the lens of the Christian mystical tradition, seeing the Trinitarian and incarnational mysteries reflected in all things good, true, and beautiful. And I think that's very clear in her work. This interview takes as its center point her newest work, a series called All Ye Who Pass By, with the first release, the first book called Gone for a Soldier. And she explores, in my view, a neglected chapter of Catholic history, the era between the Jacobite uprisings and the Catholic revival of the 19th century, which I think can be somewhat overlooked, both in England and in the Americas. But it is a time that's also replete with, as is clear in this work as well, lost causes, sacrifice, and weighty battles of conscience. And it's demonstrated heartrendingly, I see in this work as well. So Avellina is from Maryland, an American from the sort of historical Catholic heartland. And this is also a place, coincidentally, where I spent some time growing up in my childhood. She brings the perspective of an insider, as well as the passion of a storyteller and the devotion of a student of history, especially when it comes to exploring how religious tensions in England also were expressed over the Atlantic and played out in the New World. So let's begin. So Avellina, I'm really looking forward to this. So where I wanted to begin is this historical and cultural gap that your novel seems to take place in. There's not a lot of works about this particular time period, at least that I've come across, about Catholic life in England after the Jacobite uprisings, but before the Second Spring. I'm
Mhm.
wondering, why do you think this era has been so overlooked?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. There really is a dearth of proper attention being paid to the condition of Catholics in Britain and the wider British Empire during this period. I think because in people's minds, there's a lot of focus on the Tudor era, of course, because
Yeah.
that's when the split occurs. And then there's some, people who are into it. We'll think about the Stuarts, right? So they'll think
Mhm.
about the English Civil Wars and the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and so forth, and kind of connect it in some way to the Jacobite rebellions because it involves the Stuarts. And so they'll think of that, I think, as like a dynastic whole. And
Mhm.
so in some ways they're thinking, well, there's Catholics and there's Protestants, and then there's like different types of Protestants warring about, how
Yeah.
how close to Catholicism do we want to be, how far away. And so it all like fits together in some way, that kind of era of religious tension. But then I think for some people, they feel like, well, after the last failed attempt of a Stuart, or Catholic Stuart, should I say, to reclaim the throne, the situation was settled. It just was
Mhm.
kind of settled, and and England and the wider British Isles, the Protestants were in charge, and that was kind of the end of it. And you don't hear about, well, what about the Catholic recusants? Who
Mhm.
after that point, after the failed 1745 rebellion, like where were they at? And what was their position within that as well? Because, a lot of Catholics, they had to make a decision really with regards to all of those risings. Did they want to
Mhm.
take a risk on that? What were the repercussions if they did so? Should they actually make peace with the now Protestant Hanoverian monarchs? And so there was all these tensions with regards to that. But I think just a lot of people kind of almost just have in their heads that Catholics all died out. That
Yeah.
they all just kind of went away and they weren't there anymore. It was like, oh, the last gasp was kind of the 45, and then they all just withered on the vine. And of course,
Mm,
even though they were a very marginalized minority, they still were there. We didn't
mhm.
completely fade away. We didn't disappear either in the British Isles nor in the British colonies. And we were just a persecuted slash marginalized minority at various points, but we were there. And so that was something I
Yeah.
really wanted to try to touch upon in my writing.
Yes, yes. And I wanted to ask if you could explain what the term recusant means, just for anybody listening who perhaps hasn't come across this term before.
Sure. So recusant means one who refuses. And
Mm,
what it referred to was mostly Catholics, but it also could refer to dissenter Protestants
mm,
who refused to acknowledge the king or queen as head or governor of the church in England. Um, and so that was something that, stretched from the time of Henry VIII, of course, when he's trying to put through the oath of supremacy and so forth, and the Elizabethan period when she's trying to put through the oath of supremacy, and then ultimately later on under the penal laws and the test acts that were passed and that we focus on in this particular story, that existed in all different forms. There was kind of constant laws that amalgamated over time. It fluctuated, oftentimes depending on what was going on in the wider socio-political sphere. So anti-Catholicism would go up and down to greater or lesser extents in different areas of the country. It was
mm.
in flux a lot. But one thing
Yeah.
that was pretty consistent was there was always, from the time of the split, except for little brief respites for Catholics, like in the case of the reign of Mary the First, and of course people think of her as Bloody Mary because she did execute Protestants for heresy, but for Catholics she certainly was a rescuer. The reality of it,
Mm,
she rescued them from the persecution they were going through.
mhm.
So you have that brief respite, and then it all comes back and worse in a lot of different ways in terms of the Elizabethan machine that really grinds all of society, and it was an expert propaganda again exercise. It did
Yeah.
an amazing job in a kind of insidious way of convincing a people that had been richly devoutly Catholic that Catholicism was foreign, that it was
Mm,
something other than English. You cannot be, I'm going to paraphrase actually the Duke of Marlborough, who is someone who pops up in getting referenced in my work. But he
yes.
says it is impossible for a man, much less a king, to be both English and Catholic, which sounds utterly bizarre, and it really is bizarre when you're looking at English history, like all of the kings and knights and people who made up the very kind of fiber of the society. Everybody was very, very Catholic. But
Mm,
I mean, the thing is, I'm honestly convinced that people were convinced when they were saying this. Like, they didn't even see the difference after a while as the generations went on. They believed it. They were, no, that really is, like, to be English means to be Protestant, and to be Catholic. It's just impossible. You can't have the two together somehow. And they kind of drank the Kool-Aid on it, to be honest, the orange
yeah.
Kool-Aid,
Mhm.
and they
Yeah.
were convinced that it was true. And that is ironic when it comes to especially a character like Marlborough, and I mentioned a little in the story, but he was somebody who, in spite of being a reactionary Protestant, he's of course involved in the basically deposing of King James II, who converted to Catholicism and was trying to pass religious toleration acts for both Catholics and dissenter Protestants. Marlborough himself, though, even though he insists I'm the farthest thing from the beliefs of Rome, and he goes on this, whole thing that he literally commits treason over the whole thing in order to get in, William of Orange and Mary to be the Protestant sovereigns. But he himself actually has Catholic instincts in his religious life, which is really wild in a way. He's somebody who has a devotion to communion. He has, a instinct toward I must receive communion whenever possible, whenever I am in danger of death. He receives it on his knees in the mud prior to his battles. He has what can be amounted to an instinct toward Catholic devotional life. But at the same time, he's convinced that Catholicism is foreign and wicked and evil, and he needs to protect the realm from it. So it is fascinating to me, I think, that dichotomy and the sense you get of these people that they were both completely contradicting themselves, but also quite sincere oftentimes in this. So that is one of those things that just, I think, also went into fascinating me about that period because of how many people at this point had accepted this mentality as just a given. But yeah, it really is sort of tragic and fascinating at the same time.
Yeah. So from the sounds of it, Marlborough was one of those men who was Catholic and everything except for the fact that he wasn't Catholic. A bit like Henry VIII is described, I think, by Chesterton. So it's also interesting that you mentioned the Elizabethan machine and how that ground Catholicism out of the country in a lot of respects. She said or claimed to say, I believe, that she didn't want a window to peer into men's souls, but you could fool me looking at the history because it was really
She
a
was
police
good at
state.
promotion.
Yeah,
She was good at self-promotion, but I mean, the whole thing, she knew that her sister had got flack for the burning of Protestants. So she knew she had to try and achieve her ends, which absolutely was a power grab. She knew she had to try to achieve her ends with better PR. And so she did the whole window into men's souls thing just to cover herself. She and her counselors were utterly ruthless in trying to absolutely grind Catholicism out of the country. So, it's one of those things that she deserves the title bloody just as much as Mary. And the reason why she evades that is simply because, the Protestant propagandists, the Elizabethan propagandists, win out. And they maximize the achievements of the reign, many of which would have happened with or without a Protestant split. Like a lot of the achievements we think of with regards to, literature and trade coming, and advancing and colonies being planted and all these things. It really had little or nothing to do with the Protestant split, but we identify it, and many generations of Englishmen identified it with the Protestant split. That's when we started to become a power and do so well and everything like that. And that's when they kind of plugged that into the Elizabethan mythos of how they envisioned her, representing England and so forth. But it really was a propaganda machine that was enabling all of this.
Yeah, a very sophisticated one, certainly. And also the crimes that people were subjected to, the Catholics, the recusants, detailed also in your work. I think this leads on well to what I wanted to get into, which is your main character in this novel called Edmund Southworth and the Remnant Church. Could you tell us a little bit about him and what was the kind of Catholic England, or the kind of England, let me rephrase this, what had become of Catholic England by the time Edmund arrives onto the scene?
Sure. So Edmund Southworth is a young man from a Catholic recusant family in Lancashire, the county in the north of England that has the most Catholics in it, still has a very sizable minority of Catholics. And his family were an old noble family. They're the descendants of knights, and he can count among his ancestors people who fought under the Black Prince and Henry V and the Hundred Years' War, and that's how they first gained their lands. And he has this proud lineage, but due to all of these laws and these penalties that are placed upon them for their faith, they lose huge amounts of what they had. They're now down to what used to be, they used to be landholders. They owned a little tiny bit, and they shouldn't even have that. But the local authorities are kind of turning a blind eye because they don't want to upset the apple cart too bad. So they're just being allowed to sustain just that much. But they really are in a financial rut. Their house is really run down. They used to have a flock of sheep. They have like 4. Things are just greatly, greatly curtailed. And the situation, because they're being made to pay fines for non-attendance of the Church of England. And they also are paying the fines of their poorer Catholic neighbors, which was considered to be like the duty of these large Catholic houses. They said, you know, it's your moral obligation to make sure that your poorer Catholic brethren don't go to debtor's prison over this, or feel pressured so much so that they will just take the test acts and go to Anglican services. So basically that's the case with Edmund's family. They're very run down as a result of all this. And Edmund's father, Francis, is a true English gentleman of the old school and a very good Catholic who kind of in a way goes through a white martyrdom of just having to suffer through the humiliation of it all. There's so many different ways in which they are being humiliated. Not only is he seeing his house crumble, quite literally and figuratively, but he is separated out from his peers in countless different ways. The inability to own or use weaponry, to own horses, means that he can't be seen on an even class level with others of his station. And just being set aside from so many different ways in which you could be a part of society. You can't vote unless you take the Test Act. You can't participate in politics or the military or the law, nor can you go to the universities in England that were ironically founded by Catholics, of course. All of these things where, I mean, when you get down to it, then you think about the entire monarchy, the origins are, you know, Catholic, for heaven's sakes. So you end up in this situation, though, where things have been, there's both, it's like a weird double reality where things have continuity in some ways to their Catholic past, but then they also just break off or they get twisted out of shape in some way. So it's a very strange feeling. They feel like they're in exile in their own world. Like this is their home. It's the home of their ancestors. It's the land of their ancestors that they won through feats in battle, but they are being treated as foreigners, as strangers, as threats. So it's very hard for them to hold on to that faith. And Francis tries very hard, and so does his mother Perpetua, to pass it on to their children. So Edmund and his sister Teresa, basically through home education in most ways of trying to pass on these stories and these teachings of the faith. But it is very difficult, especially because of influences that, you know, will inevitably lure someone towards, you know, just giving up, essentially, just going with the flow, just join the Anglican Church and just get it over with, kind of thing. So that's kind of where they are at when the story opens.
Right. So now it's under the monarch George II. Is that correct?
It opens under George II.
Yes.
When when the story opens, Ned is a child.
Yes.
So we talk about how the Battle of Quebec, for example, has just happened in 1759. And so it is toward the end of King George II's reign.
Right.
And then later on, when we kind of jump forward into the second chapter, it's in George III's reign. So it kind of straddles the both.
Yes. Right. So by this point, many of the martyrdoms that we know of, Edmund Campion, Robert Southworth, Edmund
Hmm.
Southworth's ancestor, the priest who was martyred. All of these terrible, really gruesome martyrdoms have taken place, and the persecutions are still ongoing. But as you describe, it's at this point where to be a Catholic, the authorities, the state, all the apparatus of the state wants to make it as intolerable as possible without
Yes.
necessarily just um, executing people. It's just make this situation as intolerable as possible. I think as a father myself, I think that this is where your work is really heartrending, because you imagine what it would be like to be a father, to have a family during that time and to want to stay
Hmm.
true to the Catholic faith. The Southworths, though, in Lancashire, they you, they have a sense of noblesse oblige, as
Hmm.
you put it, and they support their the landholders, the lower classes as well. These fines were not just like a parking fine, right? Like, uh,
Yeah.
can you get into
They
like
were expensive.
the scale of these fines, Avellina?
Oh yeah, the scale, and now obviously the scale did vary at different points, but it could be crippling, crippling. And most people could not afford it, quite simply. If you
Mm,
were just a poor farmer or something, you're not going to be able to afford that. You're toast. If
mm,
you're not going to be able to pay. So you're either going to go to debtor's prison or you're going to give in.
mm.
And that, unless you have a house, again, a better off house that will pay your fines. And that's why there was this pressure being placed on the nobles to make it was psychological warfare, as you're saying, to try to make it as intolerable as possible to their pride. The nobles, they're very proud, they have this ancestry, they have this history, they have lands, they're the landholders, and will the government essentially was like, we'll just break them down bit
Mm,
by bit by bit, and their pride won't be able to handle it. And
mm.
most of them, indeed, their pride couldn't handle it. Um and and you have that occur in multiple cases. I mentioned the Gage family in the story, and that was a very
Yeah.
real happening, that
Mhm.
they gave it up for racing horses essentially. Where
Yeah.
and I mean, again, it probably was more than that. Like, in other words, they kind of reached a point where they're like, we just can't take it anymore. But
Yeah.
doing that, in other words, when a major house went down, the houses were used not only, like, yes, you had the fact that they were paying fines for people, so it's a big deal, they were keeping them sustained, but these houses would be where priests would be hidden. These houses would be where mass was said. These
Mhm.
houses would be where the Catholic community could congregate and have a place of relative safety to do so. And there was just enough of a barrier where the noble houses could get away with certain things that a rando couldn't. Um,
Yeah.
but even they can be taken down. They are not like, they don't, they're not Teflon. They can indeed,
Yeah.
and many were taken down. I mean, in the worst case scenarios, their names were obliterated. I mean, you have stories, they would know that that was the worst thing that could happen to one of those families. They
Mm,
absolutely, the name was everything. It was
yeah.
life. So what would be the worst thing? Well, if a Catholic family just got too troublesome, what they would do if they didn't have like a Protestant relative with that name to pass things over to would be they would just dissolve the name. It'd be the worst of the punishments. They would just like,
Wow.
your name is mud, you don't exist anymore. And it was
Wow.
the great terror, and that is what happened to Ned's mother's family.
Wow. I'd never known that, but that's incredibly Stalinistic. The
Yeah,
idea of
very.
unpersoning people, removing traces of them, including their name, as if they
Yes.
never existed. Uh, I wanted to ask about Lancashire because I actually have family. The Hewitt family is historically, at least as far back as we can trace, from the West Riding of Yorkshire, but they also made their way over to Lancashire, intermarried. It's sort of a tale of the red rose and the white rose, really,
Yes.
with the Hewitt family. And I don't believe that they kept the faith historically, because I think I'm at least from that side of the family, the first Catholic in a few centuries. But I wonder what the story could have been. You describe Lancashire as this hotbed of Catholicism, and it seems like the north of the country of England,
Mhm.
it has this tendency to infuriate the political center in London. And there
It
tends
does.
to be this discord, whether we're talking about the Pilgrimage of Grace or the
Mhm.
Brexit vote, for example. And
Yeah.
I wanted to ask what the reason was for Lancashire being such a stronghold for this not non-conforming, but recusant Catholicism.
Yeah, there's a lot of different theories with it, like why particularly. It's one of those things, it's like a question like why did Ireland remain majority Catholic?
Yeah.
There's a bunch of reasons and no single one. Um,
Mm,
there's, the kind of the rule of separation, if you will, in terms of the farther you are from the sort of center point of London. So the far north areas where you get Lancashire and Yorkshire and Northumberland. They're far afield from the center point of gravity of London. So things can kind of have their own sphere of influence up there, which is a little bit similar to the fact there's just that much of a separation between Ireland and mainland Britain, where Ireland kind of had
mm,
its own thing going on with regards to the Hiberno-Norman elite, and Gaelic aristocrats running the show, kind of who remained either Catholic or leaning high Anglican, typically. And there was
mm,
again that pull away from the center of gravity of London. Different fluctuations in terms of
mm,
how much the ideas of the Protestant Reformation from Europe like caught on to different areas within Britain and Ireland. Like it just a lot of different factors, in
mm,
terms of why certain things went the way they did. And I mean, to be clear, Lancashire still went majority Protestant, but they
mm.
had the highest percentage of a minority of Catholics. So it
Yeah.
still was a sizable minority, enough to really influence things in terms of people having to take at least somewhat seriously Catholic presence
Mm,
and not wanting there to be essentially religious feuds in the county. Like there was a real
mm.
sense that if you push things too far, the Catholics will rise up, kind of thing.
Right.
You have to be a little careful. And I have that reflected on in the story when it comes later on in the story to the relationship that the Southworths have, a complex relationship with the Anglican vicar, the local Anglican vicar in the village, and his family. And it's complicated. It's kind of like, on the one hand, there's this natural tension, but on the other hand, there's a sense of, trying to avoid an outright confrontation between the Protestants and the Catholics of the community.
Mm,
So that would play in very much as well in such locations. And yeah, it's one of those things that's very tricky in trying to keep a balance for the people who were there and the people who were trying to live through this kind of thing, and even trying to enforce the Anglican settlement. They kind of were like, well, we want to enforce this, but we don't want to enforce it to the point of creating a rebellion. Because as you said, the North had history. You had the Pilgrimage of Grace, you had various risings for the Stuarts, from Mary Queen of
mm.
Scots on through the Jacobite rebellions, the 1715, the 1745. So there was a sense of caution, shall we say, in
Mm.
dealing with that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I've looked at a at least a graphic which claims that about 30% of
Yeah.
Lancashire, for example, as a county, was Catholic at
Yes.
around this time period. And, of course, this isn't just sort of going to Mass at Christmas and Easter. These are really dedicated fervent Catholics as well. So it would make sense that
Absolutely. If they were still Catholic
at that
after
point,
everything they were going through,
yeah,
yeah, then they had to believe it. Nobody was a casual Catholic in
yeah,
England at this time.
exactly.
It's
So
like,
it
no,
would
no.
make sense, yeah, that they would want to really safeguard it. Well, excuse me, um, not rock the boat too much in the north,
Hmm.
especially. Um, so there's this interesting metaphor when Burgoyne, who's the other, I think, primary character in your work,
Hmm.
General Burgoyne, goes up north and he's an acquaintance of Edmund's father and a famous figure in his own right. And they go walking around the estate that is Edmund or Ned and General Burgoyne. And they walk past a flock of sheep. And by this point, the flock has diminished. There's only about 5 sheep there that the Southworths own. Um, and there's this really interesting scene where a sheep wanders off and chases after the dog and comes happily running towards towards John Burgoyne and Edmund. And the way that you put it is, since these sheep were no longer part of a proper flock, the sheep tended to become lonely and forget their true identity. Which there's a bit of a poetic sense in which that sheep may represent England, um,
Hmm.
and this also continues through Edmund's sister Tessie, who is arrested for it was sharing a brown scapular with a boy,
Hmm.
and she decries and she says that so many English children are growing up not being taught that their heritage is filled with the presence of the saints. Yet this is still Mary's dowry. The Isle of Saints, as Father Campion, that is Edmund Campion, reminded us at his trial. That's why I don't repent what I did. So we can hear this lament through Tessie. England's forgotten its Catholic soul. Saint Edmund Campion himself is my patron saint. I find his story really inspiring and really moving. And the quote that she's referencing is at his trial, where he says he's eventually executed, given the traitor's death. He says, "In condemning us, you condemn all your own ancestors, all our ancient bishops and kings, all that was once the glory of England, the island of the saints, and the most devoted child of the see of Peter." This is where the question will come here, Avellina, and the question is it's meant for us listeners today. Um, this There was a really real repudiation which you touch on in terms of the Elizabethan propaganda machine and its repudiation of England's Catholic past. And you've got these sort of the old men of the Catholic recusant order, and the new men, maybe represented by Burgoyne. Uh, so if I was a really secular postmodern heritage scholar, I'd say both of these claims are just as valid. It's all subjective, but we're not secular here, and of course we have our own loyalties here. So England still runs away from her heritage today, and it's for 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 many people that they're returning to their roots, evidenced by the return to the churches, because in recent decades, so many have been atomized and rootless by modernity, and even the Protestant and Anglican order of things is kind of seen as old hat now, which is
Yeah,
what was covered
definitely.
with Father Dwight Longenecker. So here's the question, and it's a bit of a broad one, but how can we re rediscover our roots, even across all these centuries of denial and persecution and materialism?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's a question I've asked myself because, I visited England twice, and I got a lot of the same vibes essentially that you're talking about with regards to this sense of real disassociation among people, including, as you said, the Anglicans. You see, it used to be, I feel like the Anglican split kind of went in an arc where first the Anglican project is able to ride a wave. So because it is fundamentally a nationalist project, if the nation seems like it's doing well and it's advancing in various fronts, around the world. It's becoming more powerful. Well, Anglicanism looks quite shiny and nice to go towards. It's associated with the sort of aggrandizement of the nation. And that can run its course for as long as the nation is doing well in earthly matters. The empire is expanding. There's this real sense of Britain becoming a powerhouse. Anglicanism can ride that wave. What happens when things take a turn after the two world wars? Things start to go increasingly due south. Again, there's multiple reasons for that. There's no single reason. But certainly, I would say the two world wars gave Britain some really hard hits, and she could never really fully recover up to this point in terms of various different things. And then you have various social ideas, philosophies coming in at the same time, with that, the real flux of modernity coming in. And suddenly Anglicanism doesn't seem as appealing anymore because it is fundamentally a religion of the state, and the state is not doing so well. The idea of empires falling out of favor, the whole mythos of the rise of Anglicanism and the success of England is kind of coming undone. And you can feel that. I certainly did, running into some people in England today who have a real sense of self-loathing over their own history, over their, and I'm even talking about, again, the ex-Anglicans at this point. So yeah. it's almost like I don't know how to describe it, like just something that kind of got worse and worse once they split from the church, and then there was almost a cycle. But even the ex-Anglicans have turned in on themselves, don't quite know what to do with what is Anglicanism anymore. It's almost as if it's lost its rationale for being. And so it results in this turning in on what it even meant to be British for the past number of centuries. And there's a certain sense of just embittered, cynical, not knowing where to go from here kind of a feeling. And I think that does show the sort of downward spiral of the Anglican project. As far as what to do about it, I don't have the answer in a sense of like pragmatically, how does one get out? I think it's going to take a whole kind of cycle of rediscovery, quite frankly. But one of those, the root of the cycle of rediscovery really needs to be getting back to the root of the split and saying, like, what went on here? And what is England's true identity? And I think Joseph Pearce actually did a wonderful job commenting on this in his books, Faith of Our Fathers and Merry England, where he talks about this idea of sort of eternal England and a specific reality, the spirit of England, the spirit of all that was ever good and true and beautiful and blessed about the identity, the spirit of the land, which, has sort of gone missing in a way. Not gone forever, I don't think, but certainly gone in some way into hiding. Maybe we can even relate it to the sense of like hiding in priest holes kind of thing. There is that sense of concealment that has occurred. And you can find snatches of it again. When I felt like I was doing that a lot when I was in England, trying to find glimpses of that spirit, that spiritual quality, quite frankly. And it can be disheartening. It can be discouraging, especially for someone who really loves that, I suppose, image of England that one has built up through a love of history and literature and so forth, and to see a kind of civilizational decline in the mother country, certainly for me, even on a like very, very bare bones level is painful. But as a Catholic, it takes on a whole other level to really feel the disassociation. For example, if you go into an old medieval church in England, as there are so many, you know that this was a place in which Mass was said, and you know that this was a place that was connected to the very taproot of the origin of Christianity in England. But it has been pulled away from that in another direction, and now even further pulled away from that. It's as if, and when you get, goodness gracious, I went to Ely Cathedral. I had a whole experience there. Basically, it was the on the Anglican calendar, the feast of Alfred the Great, which has a whole, Alfred the Great is this very, very piously Catholic figure, but you basically get there, and they, of all the things they could possibly be doing on that day in Ely Cathedral, relating to Alfred the Great, who enabled it to be reestablished, the community at Ely, they're having a concert in there of fake Fleetwood Mac. And I just felt totally like, of all the like things that could represent in a moment the state of England right now, that was it. It's just kind of like some kind of like loss of again, everything that is like meaningful in English identity has suddenly been, not suddenly actually, not suddenly, in a slow, progressively worsening way, been shunted aside in favor of something senseless and synthetic. I mean, when you think about these raves and the naves that go on in Canterbury Cathedral, I mean, it's just sort of like, what is going on? So it's just reached a certain pinnacle point, almost, I guess. One would hope it's reached some kind of pinnacle point, because the only thing I can hope for at this point, in terms of just how bad certain things have gotten, is that will yet reach a certain point and the pendulum swings another way, where people do start to get sick of the, I almost want to say, Gollumization of the culture. You know how, like in Lord of the Rings,
yeah,
the various,
metaphor.
whether it's the hobbits or the elves, they basically are figures that, when they are themselves properly, they are good and they are pleasing to encounter. When they get corrupted in some way, this sort of like, the corrupted variation of hobbits is Gollum, the corrupted variation of the elves or the orcs, it kind of goes down the line. The corrupted variation of men or the ring wraiths. That's kind of what it feels like in many areas of, I would say, England, that, and not just England, wider Britain, because Scotland is a complete mess as well. So it's basically like, there's a lot of that, and I think, in one way, I guess, diagnosing the problem at least would be the beginning of starting to come to some grips with it. Like, there's an actual spiritual breakdown at play, and the spiritual breakdown affects everything else. It's like it's a breakdown of Eden, I guess. Somebody like they say like sin breaks down everything.
Yes.
And that's kind of, and I'm not trying to say that England when she was Catholic was Eden, but I'm just saying that in comparison to where it's at right now,
It's
in
closer,
terms of,
I guess you could say.
exactly, closer. The taproot was much closer. And and that's kind of, I guess, what I try to show regarding Ned's experience too, that there's a hauntedness to the world he's living in. It's Catholic haunted.
Yeah, it's not a surprise that Joseph Pearce's name came up in your response to this question, because I think he touches on this well and describes, I think he uses that phrase as well, Christ haunted, England being Christ haunted. You phrased it in a way I've never heard before, which I think is really interesting. This idea that the Anglican Church, it did well while the Empire did well, but it fell apart. When the empire fell apart, it also began to lose its luster and its sheen. And it brings to mind this idea of, if you want to test the trueness of a church, how does this church suffer? What does it do
Yeah,
in the face of suffering? And in the Anglican church, you just see disintegration. Uh, the
absolutely.
the strongest voices are leaving, I feel. You look at someone like
Mhm.
Gavin Ashenden, for example. Whereas when you look at the Catholic Church, and it's not to say it's not had moments of um, of lukewarmness, for example, in the last
Mhm.
100 years, but really, when you look at the way that that church has suffered in England and the joy of the martyrs, for example, the joy in the Second Spring and in the writings of John Henry Newman and Chesterton, for example, you begin to see that spirit of Merry England, and it's never left. It's always been there, but as
No.
you say, concealed somewhat. And yeah, I get a lot of hope from the stories of these martyrs, and also from this revival, this quiet revival, and young people turning back to the
Yeah.
church. And I think that as things begin to get darker, that with the light of Jesus Christ and His church will shine all the brighter. And I think we'll also see people getting back in touch with their roots. Certainly. When we Going back to your novel and going back to General Burgoyne, he's this very vivid character, this friend of Ned's. He's charming. He can be sometimes superficial in his pursuits, but I think he's aware of that as well. A bit of a romantic soul, and he comes from a family that, not recently, but I think were enriched by the Reformation.
Under Henry
Correct?
VIII, yeah.
Yeah, under Henry VIII. Right. And there's really this contrast between the basically the English nobility rather than the monarchy seem to rule the day from the time of Henry VIII onwards. They get massively enriched by the Reformation, by the dissolution of the monarchies, and they begin to set the trend and control politics and control the monarch from that point on. Really, in such dire contrast to the recusant families that were keeping the faith alive at their own cost, who were enriching spiritually the lives of those around them. Um, but there's this interesting passage. General Burgoyne pressures Edmund to conform. He says that, essentially, what's the point? What's the big deal? When I was, during my election, there were gentlemen recusants who made the choice to take the oaths. Then they went about their merry way, to practice whatever faith best suited them. This is England, not Spain. We don't have that hot-blooded Inquisition streak by nature. The majority of us don't commonly care to look into the windows of men's souls. We English approach life by the middle way. And then Edmund replies, and thus become a middling people. So Burgoyne expresses this idea of via media, the Anglican compromise, the middle way. And it's as if he expresses it as this kind of emotional or cultural instinct in the English. And I'm wondering, do you
Mhm.
see this as really a genuine trait in the English
Mhm.
character, or do you feel like this is some social engineering? An example would be Chesterton, who I mentioned a lot, my favorite writer. He writes about the stiff upper lip being this foreign imposition from the
Mhm.
Teutonic Prussian countries, for example, not necessarily being native. I'm wondering, the via media, what's your take on that in particular, Avellina?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was actually just recently talking to a friend about this. The fact that when you think about, especially nowadays, this sort of stereotype of British people like having no emotions or having minimal emotions or something, that was not the case. Like back in history, people thought of English people as being effusive. Like I
Mm,
even remember reading, so this is during the reign of Edward VI, that an Italian visitor comes to court and basically says the English are a very effusive people. This is an Italian saying that. They're very
mm.
effusive. Edward, not so much. Edward is unusual. Edward is unusually reserved. He's laid back and he's grave. But until, and then it was like until you get to know him a bit, about 5 days of being at court, he opens up and starts acting more like a normal Englishman. So there was like this
Yeah.
perspective that, and I'm like, well, yeah, because that makes sense. Because what are the English but a concoction of Celts, Anglo-Saxons, which were absolutely, like, people forget the Anglo-Saxons were considered a fiery people, very fiery people. I mean, Augustine didn't even want to go there because people kept telling him how wild and crazy the Saxons were. He eventually gets told by the Pope, no, you need to go. But they were like considered to be these very fierce, fiery people. And then you get the Normans, for heaven's sakes. The Normans are a mix of, Vikings and Franks. These are not like, oh, they're chill, calm people who aren't. It's kind of a fiction. You notice that if one thing has stretched throughout time, like in the annals of history, about what is something that the English wanted to identify about themselves, or even that other people identified about the English. Well, the English are a proud people, and they're a hardy people. They're hardy, and they're proud, and they're tough. You don't hear anything about them being no emotion, because you see, it's, I think, a stiff upper lip is kind of a latter day version of what originally was just they are hardy, they're tough. There was a line in one of the annals, like, hardship is nothing for the English, or something like that, so hardship is no obstacle for the English, and it's translated a few different ways. But the point is that was the idea, that they were a tough, resourceful, hardy people, proud people, fiery people, but not this sort of, oh, we just go the middle way. That honestly is an Elizabethan thing that was foisted onto people, because Elizabethan re-engineering of people was to tell them, well, we're not actually like the French and the Spanish. They do all that ritual stuff. We don't. We go down the middle. We did. And it was like this kind of Anglican myth that was typically what, like, and I'm not saying that English were ever the Spanish or the French. They weren't. They were Catholic in their own way.
Right.
But at the same time, they weren't this people that, like, we don't have extremes of feeling or reaction. Like, this is kind of a myth. And that's what, but I think that Anglicans leaned into it, especially during the Enlightenment. And this is sort of a point that during the Enlightenment period, you have this real kind of flirtation with the Stoics. So I think that was sort of the beginning of this sort of stiff upper lip thing, where it's kind of like, oh, we will adopt these kind of pagan Stoics as our guiding lights, and that will feed back into this Anglican, we go the middle way kind of thing. And in a way, not to be fair, like, Burgoyne actually himself was somebody with a lot of passion and energy. He wasn't such a kind of middle way, quite like that guy. I mean, he, though, can use it if he's trying to manipulate someone into doing something he kind of wants. And in this case, he wants Ned to follow him into the military on this campaign. And so he's using pretty much everything he can to try to convince Ned, who actually is more by personality type, more of an introvert than Burgoyne. Burgoyne's more the extrovert. And Ned is more by nature a bit of an introvert, but Ned still has enough sense to know that kind of jazz about, oh, we're the middle way thing is just, it's a ploy. He knows it's a ploy. I think that makes Edmund's character actually quite tragic, because the thing is that Ned, he is not intellectually won over by Anglicanism at all, but eventually he takes a fall because he just so badly doesn't want to be seen as a coward or a traitor. That is his main fall. It's the desire more than anything to be seen as someone who is a loyal subject of the king, who will fight for the king's honor, who will fight next to his comrades, his fellow countrymen, his fellow villagers. I mean, it's very personal, it's communal. And so it's hard for him to keep saying, no, I won't fight. That is
Mhm.
ultimately what brings him down, is because he feels like his manhood is being compromised and he is coming off as a coward or someone who cannot keep faith with his country and his countrymen. And that ultimately is his weakness that pulls him down.
Mm. Yes, yes, yeah. I'd love to hear more about that, perhaps at another time, but to look into that idea of the via media being a bit of a product of social engineering, because it does also fit with what Chesterton said, and I hadn't thought of that before you mentioned it, but this idea of that being a sort of foreign imposition, the English being a
Mm-hmm.
very effusive people, known for singing and passion and romanticism and Shakespeare
Yeah.
and great grand gestures in a lot of ways. Uh, the like you wrote about the soldiers of Agincourt not all being able to receive communion, took a clod of earth in their mouth to represent their own mortality,
Mm-hmm.
to in the sense of ashes to ashes, dust to dust we will return.
And
But
to
I
imply
suppose
a
also
longing and to apply a longing for the Eucharist that they couldn't receive it. So they're
yes,
like, then if I can't receive the Eucharist, I will literally eat dirt. Like that kind. It
yeah,
was a very dramatic gesture of yearning for what
yes,
they couldn't receive.
exactly. And I feel like that actually reflects more the England that I know. And of course, there's you do meet you come across a lot of people with that kind of repressed kind of overboard Victorian explorer, stiff upper lip type vibe, I guess. But you also, I think that in the English character, you do see that gentility and that passion as well represented in a lot of people. Certainly.
And I think even in the Victorian era, there was actually a lot of effusion. I think that
Mm,
people, like if you read like Victorian literature, um,
mm.
literature that you get from like Sir Walter Scott, for example. This
Right.
is very
Yeah.
romantic because the era of romanticism was the era of um, Edmund Blair Lytton, the very romantic poet. I'm not poet, sorry, painter, but based on a lot of also like the romantic poets that come out of this period. The
Mm,
rise of romanticism, I mean pre-Victorian, but then also into the Victorian period. That is very effusive. I mean, it's not people who aren't feeling deep feelings, that's for sure. And
right. Yeah.
and when you think of I've even thought of like famous Victorian figures. Like one of my favorites from that period is actually Charles Gordon, who is a
Oh,
fascinating
General
character.
Gordon?
Yes,
Yeah, from the cartoon.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, great
And I
figure.
mean, he's a very effusive character, even as he's being stiff upper lip. Like it's both
Yeah,
going on.
yeah.
And um and he apparently had a copy of one of Newman's poems at the time that he was killed, which is quite
Oh,
interesting.
really?
So he
Wow.
he was yeah, no, he's a fascinating, and that's the thing. I think the Victorian era can get stereotyped a bit as well. Where I think actually the Victorian era we get sometimes I think muddled with the post World War era. So I think that Britain started to actually go through some real changes, and a lot of them pretty bad, during the whole kind of post-war flux, with World War One taking a lot of starch out and a lot of disillusionment happening as a result of it. And then World War Two, in a lot of ways, just putting like, kind of nails in the coffin of that mentality. So I think sometimes that disillusionment, you can even see it in like the movies made from that period about things, in the aftermath of such things. And like it's a mix because it's like, sure, there's a healthy kind of critique of empire, but then there's an unhealthy sort of self-hating thing that can happen
Yeah,
where it's like,
yeah.
everything that we try to do or try to build or try to anything that is actually any kind of reach for greatness in any way, even on a bare bones kind of worldly level, is bad. And
Yeah.
we just need to kind of hate on ourselves and be the kind of self-inflicted victims of everything bad that we ever did. And it can kind of go really downhill. So I feel like that infected, this is what I was getting back to, our view of the Victorian period. Because we think of, oh, the Victorian period is the empire builders. And they're bad. And they're all bad. And everything they did was bad. And so that sometimes can affect, like, I think how we treat them as like having no feelings or something. Because we think they're all carbon copies of each other. And we think of like the worst aspects of empire, which frankly every single empire in the history of human existence has had, not just the British. But for some reason you notice there's like the British Empire is the worst ever. And then all of a sudden they'll cut loads of breaks to non-Christian, non-European empires as being somehow better or more enlightened. And it's like, yeah, no, you know what? They also did some really crappy stuff. And it's not like they, you know, and that I think is just a sign of the decline of our Western civilization. So it's kind of where the decline of that civilization is what's causing this overboard self-hate, not healthy critique, but outright self-hate and unwillingness to do anything or rise to anything or hope for anything that actually makes some kind of a real impact, or maybe does show, as you say, kind of effusive emotion in a positive way, I mean, if anything, because there's this fear, I think, of asserting oneself at this point, because we've been told that empire building, even of the mind, is bad, or don't try to assert your ideas because you might be forcing it on someone, and it gets like this kind of breakdown, I think. One could call it Marxist, quite frankly. There is a kind of a Marxist leaning toward it with the degrees of victimhood and the ways in which that affect people in the West. And you just notice it doesn't exist, for example, in the Muslim world, not even close, in terms of the way that they view their empires. I mean, I have plenty of Muslim friends, and they don't have this hang up at all about their own empires. We do, which is like, it's like, okay, maybe we all should come to some kind of balance. I mean, I'll agree that like you can be over the top for empires, but at the same time, you can also be so anti-empire that you just make yourself a doormat. Like that's kind of where it's at. And you just are so afraid of, oh gosh, like, I mean, I've run into things like when I was in Britain, when I was trying to appreciate the culture around me in terms of really trying to get in touch with the history and the meaning of things around me, I basically went to a bookstore in Cambridge and went to what I always do when I'm here in America, go to the history section and look for, usually when I'm here, I'm looking for books on British history. It's my great passion. When I was there, I'm in Britain, for heaven's sakes, and I'm surrounded by some of the oldest, marks of British history and civilization. And yet in this British bookstore, I am absolutely looking at shelves that are peppered with self-hate. Distressingly so, peppered with self-hate. Where it's just every other book is about how terrible the empire was. And every other book is about how terrible British nostalgia is, or how terrible British romanticism is. How terrible the British are in Britain. I'm just like, this isn't healthy. I don't think the Turks are like this. Even their empire collapsed, they're not like this. But for some reason, the Brits are.
No, exactly. I think that it's led to this great cynicism, and it's interesting that you link this to this idea that being effusive or being passionate and bold and all of that, that takes a certain belief, a sense of a sense of belief either in yourself or in the civilization that you're part of.
Hmm.
And that's simply not there for a lot of people. And so what you're left with is this jadedness, this exhaustion with history, this cynicism. But I think that's something that a lot of people are finding really repulsive now, and they're beginning to see that
Yes.
actually there's so much good in England and in our history and in the Christian faith as well that
Yeah.
we've lost, that we've
Which is the most important
given up
thing
on.
beyond all of the
Exactly,
other stuff.
exactly, yeah. And um, you'd mentioned, of course, that like England and its sort of passion is not, it's not France, it's not Spain, and that makes sense because we're in Ireland. We've not necessarily been constantly at war with each other or with the
Right.
Moors in Spain or the Germans or Italians in the case of the French. So we've developed it, I suppose, a little bit more peaceably, but yeah, that positive vision of Englishness is something that we've lost, but I think it's also something that has only been concealed and is returning as
Hmm.
well. I'd like to get into the British Army in Canada
Hmm.
because eventually Ned finds his way into the British Army.
Hmm.
Ned being Edmund, of course. And in Canada, the situation is quite complex. It's the aftermath of the fall of Quebec, and you've got the British colonial force with a largely French Canadian populace. The British Army itself is this hodgepodge of Irish recruits, Highlanders, Scotland, some French volunteers, English chaps like Edmund and Burgoyne, and yeah, most of them have to renounce their faith except for the French volunteers, of course. And
Hmm.
I'm wondering what maybe might be the reasons for someone from the lower classes to uh, to do this. And we've spoken a little bit about fines, but yeah, what did this maybe what are some of the stories from these lower classes who joined the
Sure.
army?
So the British Army, as you said, was very multi-layered, multifaceted. People from all walks of life joined. There's kind of a stereotype that, oh, it was only like the dregs or people in the slums, but that's not true. I mean, people,
The
yes,
scum of
people
the
joined from
earth,
there,
right?
but yeah, scum of the earth, exactly. We have the
Yeah,
Wellington quote,
yeah,
which never, it funnily enough, usually never gets fully quoted, where he says, "Okay, then we're going to have to make something of them," and like at least he has a little more of a positive image than merely
yeah,
just saying that. It's like, okay, so he's trying to, he's saying it's really bad, but we have to like make them work. We have to get this into shape. I'm like, okay,
yeah.
but but yeah, no, we have that image in our minds where they really are all just kind of the slums, kind of people who are maybe criminals, this, that. And I mean, I think we need to remember, number one, Wellington was being dramatic. He was being dramatic. And number two, he was very much of an aristocrat. So he had like,
Yeah.
a way of saying it. Um, but in reality, plenty of people from, you know, farmers and shopkeepers and just normal people with families and businesses and lives, either lower or middle class people would join the army, would follow the drum, would take the king's shilling. So you had lots of people from all different walks of life, all different kind of ratios of society, who would get kind of interested in doing that. And they would think of it as, hey, it's another job opportunity. It's a way to see the world. It's a way to learn new things, meet new people. It's a way to have a new network and way of having social mobility.
Hmm.
So there was all different ways in which you could get a leg up for, and as you mentioned, like in the situation of Irish Catholics, this really was, if you renounce your faith in any way, it's a leg up. Let's just be honest, because Catholics are not exactly having a fun time of this. But certainly, if you join the army, you're being promised a number of things, because oftentimes you'd have like Anglo-Irish landlords, right, would want
Mhm.
to raise a regiment or something like this. And so what they would say to their tenants would be, hey, you guys, if you join up, your families will get better food. You'll get higher end food, and you will have to pay less rent, that kind of thing. And so that was a real, a real kind of lure to do that. And also, again, you have an option for better social mobility. You can potentially get up a bit in terms of how you're connected and what kind of reputation you have in society. And so, you had that certainly being a temptation for people who were Catholic. And again, like just again, regular people joined for all manner of reason to get new experiences, get new opportunities, get better pay in different areas if certain jobs weren't paying as well. And some of them did indeed do it out of a patriotic motive to serve king and country. Sometimes it was a mix of all of these things. It wasn't like, one thing or another. Like there's a great in book 2 I'm working on now, I'm incorporating a character which is based off of real letters. Who, I mean, this guy, on the one hand, you think, well, he kind of almost fits the kind of like, he gets basically pressed into the army, because there's that going on as well. You have these press gangs at different points who would press people into the army or navy. And this guy gets pressed out of a brothel. They raid the brothel. He gets grabbed. He gets taken in and put in the army. And, he's not too thrilled with that at first. But then he kind of, in his like writing back home, he sort of is like, yeah, but you know what? All of this I've been through at this point. And he ends up in some of the most dangerous battles of the French and Indian War and survives. He's like amazingly preserved in a number of cases. He basically says by the end of it, okay, yeah, this wasn't exactly my plan, and this whole thing wasn't my plan for the evening for sure. But at the same time, here we are, and I feel proud to have served my king and country. By the end of it, I do. I feel proud to have done that. So you get the impression that, you see, because it was part of the culture, and this is another whole element, but really, to view your country as something worthwhile, to view your king as, of course, being the embodiment of the country, it was worthwhile, even to a rando from a brothel. Like in other words, there still was something in the culture that was like, okay, maybe I'm not the most polished guy on the planet, but I know enough that, to serve your king and country is honorable. It's an honorable thing. And so even if where I got picked up wasn't particularly honorable and how I got picked up wasn't how I wanted, still, at the end of the day, I'm proud I did it. I'm proud of the service. And, it's something that's still worthwhile. And that, again, kind of ties back into the kind of the spiritual ethos of things, that to believe in something higher than yourself, and the idea that something has meaning, your country has meaning, your king has meaning. There's something that's meaningful, and it's like kind of a chain of being thing, isn't it? It's like God and your king, and then your country, your community. It's all tied together in some way. And again, even someone who's imperfect themselves could know that it's part of the culture. It's instinctive to know that much. And I try to show that. I try really hard because, in America now, there really is, I think, a lack of understanding what we were. What we were. I mean, when you think about it, like my town, for example, in Maryland, Taneytown, was founded in the 1750s. I always think about this and saying, well, when we were founded, we had a king. Literally, America did not begin in 1776 or 1783. America has a much more organic life to it, and being American has many more layers to it than simply the political shift that occurred that resulted in us becoming a republic. We are not reducible to that. We have all of these ties and roots that go further back into older modes of thinking. And so this was something I tried to lean into in the writing, was to show those modes of thinking, to really try to, because so often in books or in movies or in TV that deals with the American Revolution, it really is just kind of, I would say, honestly, a modern perspective. And the modern perspective that was born out of the success of the revolution, because once the revolution was successful, it created the chain reaction that did lead to many of the things in the modern world. Um, and so, for example, the proliferation of republics. So in our heads now, in the modern sphere, we kind of think, oh, it was all like meant to be in some cosmic way, that
Mm.
republicanism is the like grown up thing. And it's like, well, that could be totally debated. And I think that that's what I kind of tried to lean into, is that, well, no, there's a whole case to be made for why these people, whether they are from the mother country or whether they are from, America or the colonies, why they believe in fighting for a sovereign, which is kind of a whole point, why that it means something to them, how it ties into their honor, how it ties into their self-understanding, why they would be willing to fight and die for that, why it matters. And so that is something I try and lean into when it comes to the various military figures that I do put in. I try to show the nature of their loyalty as best I can based on actual sources that they talked about it a lot. And so that, I think, also again ties into the religious tradition, because even in the case I cameo King George III, and he himself was a pious man. Is actually one of the few, I would say, comparatively few of all of the monarchs of England and wider Britain, who was like truly pious, like really personally pious, on a deep level. And I think that he really did very sincerely take his role, as his belief as being governor of the Church of England in a very religiously kind of in sync way. He wasn't Henry VIII. And that's what I think made it very interesting in the writing too, because this is what makes Edmund's problem more complicated. Because honestly, like, when you think about Henry VIII, he's just the worst kind of guy. So it's easier in a way to think of dealing with somebody like Henry VIII and saying, no, I don't see you as head of the church. Good Lord, no. Or Elizabeth too, quite frankly. She was very Machiavellian. She really didn't have a religious core going for her.
Right.
But when it comes to, in this case, George III, he does. He is a pious Christian. And so that creates this sense of layers to Edmund's reaction to him, and the way that he then sees himself as having an obligation to defend his honor as both the king, but also a man that he does respect. So there's that level as well.
Yes. Yeah. So in being an American with, I suppose, some loyalist sentiments, as you've described yourself in your foreword as well. And in this work, it reminds me a lot of Puritan's Empire by our mutual friend, Mr. Charles Colomb. And Avellina, can you hear me okay? Yeah, you've just paused. Are we back?
Are we back?
Yeah, we're back. Yeah, great. So yeah, I was saying that you yourself, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the affections between you and our mutual friend Charles Colomb. And I read his work, Puritan's Empire, as well, looking into the causes of the American Revolution, but also the Catholic roots of America. Not to say that they are the only roots of America, but they are certainly there, just in as much at the same time as the Puritan movement takes root there as well. You had this great scene in Canada where there's a Eucharistic procession, and you see that there's all these conflicted soldiers, whether it's Ned himself or whether it's the Irish conscripts who are, furtively making the sign of the cross, which I just felt is a really moving scene, because you imagine how heartrending that must have been to see the Eucharist, the center of the Christian universe, Jesus Christ himself, being led in procession before you, and not wanting to give away that you are really still in your heart of hearts a Catholic.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really really moving, to see this conflict within the British Army itself. I want to move to America, to the Revolution, to the American history, as this continuation, as you mentioned, like it didn't start in 1776. You suggest, I believe, that um, through, I think it was a conversation between Fraser, maybe potentially Fraser, and this French priest, that the priest says that
Well, was it
your
Jonathan? Was it?
Jonathan, it may have been Jonathan, but basically the priest says your line of kings began this severing of links when they declared their own headship over spiritual matters. So this idea of hierarchy being flattened, revolts, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be the suggestion that the American Revolution is a continuation or a consequence of the English Reformation. I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering, would you agree with that label? How would you put
Yeah,
it? And could you
I,
expand on
I
it?
would I would say that there are striking similarities to arguments that were made for the split from Rome to arguments that were made from the split from the mother country by the revolutionaries. You basically have a situation where, in that scene that you're referencing, yes, so you have Lieutenant Jonathan Rawcliffe, who is a good person. He really is, but he can inadvertently gaslight. And he's a pious Anglican himself, and he's again very well intentioned. And he tries to take Ned kind of under his wing a bit, and he has a conversation with, yes, the French Canadian priest who accompanies the French Canadian volunteers, and he's actually talking to him about the Irish conscripts, and he's saying you shouldn't be giving confession to these Irish conscripts. And the priest essentially is like, I'm going to give confession to whoever comes to me, man. Like, but basically they do end up actually developing a friendship, though, Jonathan and the priest, through the story. And yeah, what it is that he's trying to point out is really he's trying to make Jonathan think, because when you start to break down the Anglican arguments, it's that, oh, we're all grown up. They would actually say it's like we've evolved to run our own affairs. We don't need you, church. We don't need you. We can do our own thing. We are a rock. We are an island. And so there
Mhm.
was this kind of argument being made that you can sever ties with Mother Church and do your own thing, do your personal pan pizza thing,
Mhm.
of a religion. And that, of course, creates multiple different consequences, which come from, once that split is made, a zillion other splits come out of it. It's like the never ending split that results in the English Civil War and all other kinds of things with regards to split happening.
Yeah.
And so what you end up with is the influence, as you say, of various different Protestant sects in America, and the way in which those Protestant sects and dissenting sects and different things influence the way the different colonies develop and so forth. And then ultimately, you do have the real, I think, fundamental reason for the American Revolution was the Enlightenment that was happening, the philosophies of the Enlightenment. Because when you start to think about it, honestly, the issues that we more or less hear were the causes of the American Revolution, like, for example, taxation without representation. Quite frankly, lots of places did not have representation. Lots of people did not have representation. Now, there can be a whole argument made, should they have gotten representation? Okay, but are we going to unleash a bloody fratricidal war over this, in which, I mean, it was a horrific war. I don't honestly see the justification behind it in like a just war theory kind of thing.
Mm.
Not with the kind of taxes that were even being passed. I mean, they were very legit taxes in terms of war taxes for the French and Indian War and for basically paying off the colony's own defense. So it really was not this horrific tyranny. It was something that I think a legit argument could be made that maybe things should get more progressive in the way the empire was run and you have a better system of representation for everybody. But come on, this is like this is a time period where vast majority of the people in Britain did not have like direct voting or representation. This is also a time when Catholics obviously didn't have representation, and we kind of touch upon that a little bit when Ned first hears about how they have issues because of representation, and he's like, since when did my family have representation? And we are of the ancient of days of this noble family. Like, in other words, there's all kinds of representation issues. So it was one of those things where to say that the representation issue was enough, like was bad, was so horrible. And again, this is also in a time period when other European powers, right, just directly tax their colonies. They do. So it's not like this is like unusual out of the full, wild blue. Now, it was something that I think this is what caused some of the problems and some of the backlash. Britain was reticent to directly tax her colonies. She didn't do it very often. She did it very rarely. But there was at no point that she said, I will never do it. So it was sort of like just something that wasn't being done very much. And so then when it was done, it sort of came in out of left field and it felt a bit heavy-handed, which is like, right. I understand that, but is that enough? Is that really enough to again, generate a fratricidal conflict and forswear, more to the point, forswear your allegiance to your king that you have sworn? When you think about this, you've taken a Bible with the cross on it, you've put your hand on that Bible, and you've said, I will be true to the king. I will defend the king's honor. I will be a loyal subject to the king. Pretty much all of these people did that at some juncture who were in any way in the like military or in politics within the colonies. Right. Mm-hmm. So you think of George Washington, for example. I mean, he was in the Virginia militia. This is what he would have taken multiple times. And when he was involved in politics of any type, would have taken it multiple times. All of them would have. So this is heavy, heavy vow you're taking. And the old form of it, they literally say, may my heart be cut out if I, go back on this. Is it enough? And I always have the sort of the problem with it. Is it really enough with the taxation issue, or even some of the other issues where I think Britain did make heavy-handed mistakes, like in terms of certain things that they wanted to crack down on, like smuggling. They wanted to crack down on smuggling, but in the process, they did searches without warrant. Okay, was that a good idea? No, I don't think so. Was that enough to unleash a fratricidal war? No. And so that is, I guess, where I would largely agree, as you say, with Charles Colomb, and where I think fundamentally it didn't have to do with that. I really don't think it was about these grievances that may have had certain points, but not enough to do what was done. I think it came down to the Enlightenment. More fundamentally, the Enlightenment came along and said, we want to try something new. That was fundamentally what the issue was. It wasn't because of these were excuses to essentially come and say, we want to try something new that is based on reason. And so that basically the idea is we want to essentially create this, utopia based upon just kind of starting over again, starting with a new program, so to speak. And we'll use various arguments that actually we're going back to some purer form of something somewhere. But it felt kind of Protestant, quite frankly. You know how the Protestants will sometimes do that. Like they'll try to go back to some mythic time when everything was pure that doesn't exist. There's no perfect purity like that.
Thomas Paine, writing about throwing off the Norman yoke. Was that Thomas Paine, for example, writing about the American Revolution and English liberties and all of that?
Thomas Paine, unfortunately, Thomas Paine was unfortunate in a lot of departments. He was a radical even by revolutionary standards, really, really radical. He was very, very left-leaning deists. And I mean, to clarify, there were actually quite based deists. I mean, in the sense that, like, you know, okay, deists, yes, they were rejecting various points of traditional Christian teaching, but at the same time, you had very religious deists. Like, in other words, they were very just more traditional in their understanding of, you know, God and providence and things of that really mattered to them. And then you had this other group that was very left and almost leaning into kind of a starting to get into atheistic agnostic zone.
Mm.
Paine was leaning into the very left-leaning zone of that. And he really did, as you say, use some terrible arguments, in my opinion. You have that, though, that kind of Enlightenment argument with regards to, like, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll go back and we'll say the Saxons were awesome, the Normans were dreadful, and we'll kind of just not take into consideration all the nuances that developed England, which really, I mean, I'm just like, think of all of the good things the Normans brought to England that fundamentally formed England as she is. You know, and this kind of goes into my first novel was actually all about this because it was set during the aftermath of the Norman conquest. So I tried very hard to show that, you know, yes, the Saxons certainly had it hard, and I show what the Saxons went through, but at the same time, the Normans did have their own side of the story. They did bring good to England. You can't just say, oh, the Normans, they were just completely horrible. And, you know, and unfortunately, though, that's what some of these people were doing because they were trying to create a myth that they were reaching back to and saying, oh, this was when everything was pure and wonderful and there was perfect liberty for all. And then the terrible Normans came and that's when everything went wrong. And they were trying to kind of recreate, therefore, a reason of why they could now do this revolution and why they could forswear their oaths. That was kind of the idea. They were kind of trying to come up with the idea, why can we forswear these oaths? And you notice in the Declaration of Independence, it becomes after the more famous intro, right? So you have the more famous introduction about all men being created equal and whatnot. But afterwards, after you get past that part, it kind of becomes a long laundry list of excuses for why they think they can break their oaths. It really does start to become, to me, certainly problematic because it is like, well, okay, so does any of this actually, like in terms of actually justify? I mean, frankly, from a Puritan point of view, it made more sense for, like, for example, the Puritans and the Covenanters in Scotland, the Puritans in England, to see Charles I as being a tyrant. And the reason why is because he was trying to enforce a religious settlement on them, which they believed to be a violation of the people of the Lord and the prerogatives of the Lord. They believed that he was too high church and he was trying to force them to be high church, and they believed that was heathenry. And so I actually respect them more, way more, than I do the revolutionaries because the sincere Puritans, the sincere Covenanters were all about the honor of God as they understood it. They understood it in a certain way, which I don't agree with, but I still understand, like, they were still based in that belief. And they were saying, we're doing this for the honor of God. And the reason why we are saying that we can forswear our allegiance to this king is that he has betrayed the honor of God. That is our cutoff point. I would say that's a much more based cutoff point to have. In what way did George III, the very pious George III, very middle of the road Anglican, middle of the road in a good way, though, middle of the road in the sense of he was middle, he was not too high church or low church, he was middle in that sense, but he was very pious personally, so he wasn't middle of the road in the sense of lax. In what way did he defame the honor of God or try to force anyone to beyond what was already on the books, so to speak? Force anyone, you know, to do, like, again, what sort of Charles I was really trying to enforce his prayer book, for example, and certain liturgical things. He would try to force every single person to have it. George didn't do that. So I'm just sort of like, it really, really, really is a strain to try to call George a tyrant. all that he did was essentially uphold Parliament's right to tax the colonies, which Parliament at no time said that they couldn't do. They just rarely did it. So I struggle, even if people wanted to come, right, and say, we want to change things, right? So they wanted to be innovative and they wanted to say, no, but we think this should change. Okay, there are legitimate arguments to be made for that. But to say that, and if you don't change it the way we want you to, it's tyranny, I think is just a step in a very strange direction. And at the end of the day, I don't even think it's the reason. I think the reason was really just they wanted to try something new. They were very excited about the Enlightenment ideas that were coming out. You get all of these things with regards to, as you say, Paine and Jefferson and Washington later on. Washington starts out as an uber monarchist, by the way, when he was young, very, very zealously royalist. And then, you know, he kind of does a 180. But you get that. I mean, I'm reading, interestingly enough, right now, a biography of Charles Carroll, which has to do with Maryland very much, you know, because he was very helpful in terms of getting Maryland to get rid of its penal laws, essentially. But as far as consistency when it comes to his arguments for why the revolution is legitimate, all over the map. Because, for example, he would make one argument, like from a Catholic kind of pitch. Well, the Hanoverians, they're not like technically the rightful kings because of the, you know, ousting of James II. But then he would turn around and say, but I didn't like James II anyway, because I'm an Enlightenment bug. And it's like, right, okay, so that just counteracted that argument. And it's like, well, so then you're, and furthermore, it doesn't even make full sense, because at that point, even the Pope had acknowledged the Hanoverians as being the de facto kings of England, and we got to just make peace with them and pitch it. And King George III is a pretty reasonable guy under the circumstance, so let's just try and get a balance going here. You know, he's not making things worse. I think that was the point. It was kind of like this. The situation in England was far from good, but is the king making things worse? No, he's kind of stable, actually. So, like, let's just try to improve things with him. Just trying to, you know, and so basically what you find is that Carroll was just as influenced as the rest of them by this Enlightenment philosophy. It was very, very strong. It came over from France and from other locations. And that fundamentally, the underlying reason that the revolution happened was that the Enlightenment caught on, and you had this movement of Enlightenment people wanting to try something new. And that does, in its way, mirror the kind of breakaway effect of the Protestant revolt. And at the end of the day, it feels almost like karma kind of in its way, where, especially, like, again, as I'm writing book 2, which really gets into the disaster of Saratoga, and it was a massive disaster for Britain. And human cost was immense. But the idea that basically they were asking, you have this in actual memoirs, are we being punished? It feels like we're being punished. Nothing we can do goes right in this war. Something feels like we're being punished. So I kind of leaned into that and said, well, if you want to get technical, it feels almost, again, like karma, like one split, that they made all these arguments of why they needed to do this split to try something new for kind of a power consolidation grab is kind of repeating itself, but they're getting the back end of it now. So it was interesting to explore it that way. And certainly Edmund very personally feels this, because his guilt is tremendous for what he has done in order to join the army. So he feels almost as if it's a personal curse that's been attached to him and what's going on around him. But certainly he can see the pattern that is occurring with regards to the war and the split.
So there's a sense of the chickens coming home to roost with the American Revolution, with the Enlightenment as well. So there's a multifaceted answer here for the roots of the American Revolution. To say that it's a direct consequence of the Reformation, I think yes, the argument could be made, but it's there's different stages to that. There's the Enlightenment being a byproduct of the Reformation itself. The Christian faith taking the church out of the equation and making it only between, the Christian, the Bible in front of them and God, and taking out the authority that Christ has established, then all of a sudden, people will take the Bible out of that equation. And then it's just man to God with the
And
deus, or just man at the
absolutely.
center of the universe through the
Humanism,
Enlightenment.
the
Yeah,
humanism element that then takes over. And also the fact that once you've done it with when you think about it, once you've taken the Pope out of the equation, what's actually to stop you from taking the king out of the equation? Like, in other words,
right.
there's like a authority structure breakdown at that point. So what's like your allegiance is broken down. So it's like, what's to say? Who's to say that this allegiance can't just be dissolved when you decide that this or that is imperfect, or this or that is corrupt, or whatever. Who's to say you
Yeah.
can't do that once it starts being done?
Like George Washington as an example. Like you've got the English nobility enriching themselves as a consequence of the dissolution of the monarch of
Mhm.
the monasteries, and that creating this oligarchic class of incredibly wealthy noblemen. And I suppose you can also see that in the American Revolution. It's not necessarily the common folk who are leading the revolution in America. No, it's the landed
The planters
American
and the merchants.
aristocracy, the merchants, real wealth going into it. Of course, there's within the Enlightenment, there's also the influence of the Freemasons as well, and
Mhm.
the work that they were doing to undermine the altar and the throne um, in their own ways in America and later on in the 19th century. So there's really a lot going on in this tumultuous
Oh yeah,
time in history. But
a
I
lot of
think that.
different, yeah,
Oh,
a
go
lot of
ahead,
different
please.
a lot of different socio-political tides were going in and
Yes.
out, and that I think was what, yeah, was creating the age of revolutions. Because again, it was, and the American Revolution was the domino that went down, that kind of created, if you will, the sort of all the dominoes to fall. Which I have a few times characters say that they can sense that if this works, if this revolution works, if this goes through, if America becomes a republic, it will have a chain reaction. They will not be able to control the chain reaction or how far it will go. So that's why some people are very motivated to try to stop it, because they say if this goes through, it's not like the old rebellions. I have General Fraser, say it at one point, and he says it like it's not like the old Jacobite rebellions, for example, which his family had been involved in, saying, those were about dynastic claims. And it's not even like the Puritans and the Covenanters when they rose up, because that was about religious claims. This is something different, something new, and something that, if it catches on, will not be able to be controlled and will spread all across the old world as it does in the new world. And of course, depending on one's perspective, that is either a good or a bad thing, or maybe a mixed thing. But so for the people who are pro revolution, the people who are pro enlightenment theory, they're very much like, hey, this is a good thing. This is spreading the liberation of man everywhere and so forth. But for those, I think, with a little bit of insight into what goes down, you're looking at absolute chaos in a lot of cases. And
Yes.
not so much the liberation of man as much as just changing masters, often to a worse group of masters, and oftentimes Madame Guillotine.
Mm.
There's basically a real, also in a more subtle way, I think, a destruction of the internal integrity of you might say the body of countries and the body of kingdoms. So there's like a disintegration that occurs when you, for example, take away gradually the idea of the sovereign as both a real force, um, but also like as a spiritual figure on some level. You
Mm.
you sap that away gradually, you are reduced to what General Thomas Gage called, and I think is actually a great quote, even though people often use it to mock him, democratic despotism. And they will say,
Mm.
oh, he's just being an aristocrat who doesn't. And I'm like, no, he was right. There really, there is such a thing as too much democracy. I think we've come so much to see democracy as this like automatically good word all the time that we don't think about it. Like, well, democracy is complicated. Some democracy is good, some democracy can be bad. Too much democracy can indeed become despotic and chaotic for that matter. So it I think is one of those things where we find ourselves living in the wake of many of these things that have almost taken their course in some way.
That's a good
And
way
that's
of
what we
putting it.
will see. We'll see like what comes of it, to come. There's always,
Yeah.
while there is history, there is hope, so to speak, in terms of
Mhm.
things. I think that we certainly will see more of a, I hope so at least, appreciation of older modes of being, things like the idea of sacramental kingship, for example, and things like that. But I think that we are still living off of the old Enlightenment kind of energy a little bit, and we're still trying to actually deal or deconstruct perhaps some of that assumption that is so strong in us that modernity is so great that we don't want to question anything that led to it. Modernity is
Yeah.
awesome, and I think as we should be questioning whether which parts of modernity are actually good and which parts are actually not so good and what led to what, and start to use a more mature analytical process in that.
Yeah. So I think there's a good question now to the proponents of modernity, the proponents of the current year, quote unquote, so to speak. That like you look around at the atomization, at the despair, and you've got to ask, have you had your fill of modernity yet? Have you had your fill of the Enlightenment yet? And from this age of enlightenment have sprung some of the worst conflicts in human history, and such repudiation of our spiritual and historical heritage as well. So, to anybody who's had enough of that, then I think your book, All That Passed By, or You That Passed By and Gone for a Soldier, um, they can provide some great inspiration and give us a sense of what it means to have a Catholic identity within this sort of new reality that
Mhm.
in so many ways is opposed to the Catholic order. So yeah, we pray for a return as well. And with that, I wanted to say thank you very much for a fascinating conversation, Avellina. And it's really been a pleasure. And I wanted to ask if you would pray for our listeners and for our audience who have joined us for this.
Certainly. And thank you, by the way, as well for having me on. It's been really lovely conversation to have and getting the opportunity to talk about these themes and so forth.
Yeah,
But anyway,
it's
yes.
been really a
So,
pleasure.
in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, help us to find our roots in you. Help us to find what is truly meaningful in our human experience, to connect with that which is true and good and beautiful. Help us to be able to see that glimmer of hope, even when things are rather dark, and even when we don't have all the answers or know how all the outcomes will play out, that we do have a certain faith um, that, as Tolkien said, eucatastrophe, is sort of fundamental to what we believe in Christ. We believe in crucifixion and resurrection. We believe in the great turnabout. We believe in conversion, redemption, grace. And for all of these things, we can believe that no good thing is lost forever because everything that is truly good is a reflection of God and that has a place in the eternal. So we pray that we may all be able to find that and share that in our own lives. and across the world, wherever we may be located, especially in Britain, and in America, which, is still in many ways has the roots of Britain. We're the seed of Albion. We are connected spiritually. We will be forever. And so for that to be realized, that we may more truly find our deepest spiritual selves. And we pray for that in Christ, in the name of the Father, and the Son, Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you very much, Avellina. And to wrap things up, Gone for a Soldier, it reveals a hidden chapter of Anglo-American religious and cultural history, the ties between these brother nations. Through characters like Edmund and John Burgoyne, Avellina invites us to see the wounds that were left, the marks of the Reformation in England, as well as the sacrifices of those people who really tried to hold on to something eternal in an age of compromises and experiments. I wanted to ask Avellina, where can our listeners find more of your work?
Yeah, so I'm available on Amazon. If you just type in my name, I pop up on Amazon and Goodreads. On Amazon, you can find All Ye That Pass By. This is the book version. There are two versions of it, by the way. So one is the large book. It's fairly large. It's a fairly thick read. And then for some people who had wanted another option, there also is a split version, which is book 1, part 1, and book 1, part 2. So they're like 2 volumes. It's also available on Kindle. So there's options for that. And also on my page, I have my first novel, which is a Robin Hood retelling. Which the book series is called The Telling of the Beads, which I'm still working on. And the first book is called Saplings of Sherwood. And it's again, basically Robin as a child and a teen. It's the origin story. So that is available again through paperback and Kindle. And I have a number of poetry books and anthologies on there as well that I've been a part of. So yes, all of that should be there on Amazon. And I have a website as well, AvellinaBalestri.com. So, and also if you want to look at my magazine, it's Fellowship and Fairydust.com. So all of those things. I'm also quite active on social media. So if anybody would like to get in touch with me via Facebook, you could just look me up. I'm available there, or Instagram. I'm also available there. So if anybody would be interested in getting in touch, I'm welcome that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to include a host of links down below in terms of Amazon, your social handles and whatnot. But I wanted to say thank you very much for a really engaging conversation about Anglo-American history and the Catholic Church. So
thank you so much.
yeah,
Greatly
God
appreciate
bless. It's been a pleasure.
God bless.
Take care, Avellina.
Thank you.